Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be talking about the sexual mode of reproduction in plants. Sexual reproduction. What is sexual reproduction? First of all, let's look into the detail and what is difference between the sexual and asexual reproduction, and then we'll talk about in flowering plant. Sexual reproduction takes place by combination of special reproductive cells, and these cells are called as sex cells. And we have two types of sex cells. One is a male sex cell and there is a female sex cell. Each sex cell has a special part which is called as the gamete. So we do have male gamete and the female gamete. So the male gamete and the female gamete are the one which brings in the information or the what we say the nucleus substance which will help in to develop into new organisms. Okay, so sexual reproduction of in sexual reproduction, the male gamete will always fuse with the female gamete to form a new cell. So the cell which carries this male gamete is called as the male sex cell, and the cell which carries this female gamete is called as the female sex cell. Okay, the moment the male gamete and the female gamete fuse together, the cell is called as, when the combination together, the cell is called as zygote. So this zygote will further develop, grow and form a new organism. So as I already mentioned, we'll be talking about the flowering plant and the reproduction in flowering plant. Right. So let's talk about the different parts of the flower first of all, and the two major parts, that is the female reproductive part and the male reproductive part of the flowering plant. Now the main parts of the flowering plant are staple, petals, stamen and carpel. So let's look which are the staple. So staple is this, right? Before the bud comes, there are two leaf-like structure, which is the staple. Then you have the petal, the attractive colors, colorful petals of a flower. Stamen, which is the reproductive part of the male reproductive part, and the carpel is the female reproductive part. Right? So stamen produces pollen. So if you can see this complete section is stamen. Okay. Anther is the swollen part of the stamen, and it contains the pollen grains, and filament is the stalk. So if you can see here, this is the stalk which is called as the filament, and this bulgy part is called as the anther which contains the pollen grains. So as a whole, this structure is called as the stamen. Okay, anther and filament together is the stamen, the male reproductive part. Now if you come down to the greenish section, this whole section is called as the female reproductive part, which is the carpel. So it has stigma, then you have your style, okay, and this style will be the style which is connecting the stigma and the ovary, okay, and you have ovary which is present here. Now style is not represented here because style is produced while the pollen grain sticks on the stigma. So let's look into the detailed parts of the female reproductive part. Stigma is the part of the carpel or the female reproductive part which receives the pollen grains, and it produces a sticky substance so that the pollen grain sticks to that. Okay. Once the pollen grain sticks to the stigma, it produces a connecting tube. It produces a tube which starts flowing down towards the ovary. This tube is called as the style. And ovary is the one which is having the female gamete, which is called as the ovule, and it stores the ovules within itself. Right? Now, we have two different types of flowering plants. One is called as those flowering plants which have only male flowers or only female flowers. Any one type of flower, then they are called as unisexual flowers. Like in papaya plant, this is the male flowering plant which has pollen grain and only stamen. Whereas this one is a female papaya plant which has the ovary, stigma and style. Okay. Same way we have male cucumber plant which has stamen and female cucumber plant. So those flowers which contain either of one, means any one, either stamen or carpel, then they are called as the unisexual flowers. The flowers which have only the male reproductive part, they are called as male flower, and the flowers which have only the female reproductive part, they are called as the female flower. So unisexual flowers. And the other type of flower is bisexual flowers, which has both the female part and the male part. So if you can look, and both of them, it's the hibiscus. Okay. Now this is the stamen, the anther and the filament. Same way here we have the stigma, okay, which is the reddish part. So then which is the pollen grain and anther filament? This yellowish dot-like structures are the pollen which are stuck on the anther, and there is a tiny filament below that. So this section with yellow dots are the stamen. The reddish bulgy part is the stigma, and then you have the tubing which is connecting the ovary, right here. So the flower which has both the stigma, style, ovary, that is the female reproductive part, and anther filament, that is the female reproductive part in the single flower, is called as bisexual flower. Okay. Now you need to transfer the pollen grain, okay, to the stigma of the flower. So the process of transferring the the pollen grain to the stigma, the process of transferring the pollen grain to the stigma of the flowering plant is called as pollination. There are two types of pollination. The first type is cross self-pollination. The other is the cross-pollination. Self-pollination happens in bisexual flower because they have both the parts of the reproductive parts of the same flower. So it's very easy for transferring the pollen to the stigma in the same flower. Whereas cross-pollination happens between unisexual flowers, wherein we need some external factors to help it to transfer the pollen grains from one flower to the other flower. So let's look into the start. So pollen grains are transferred in the same flower is called as self-pollination. So as you can see here, the tiny yellowish parts are the pollen grains which are transferred to the stigma, which is the greenish part of the carpel. Similarly, if you can see here, the pollen grain are here, which are being gradually transferred to the brownish structure, which is the stigma. Correct? So the process of transferring a pollen grain to the stigma of the plant is called, of the flower, is called as the self-pollination. Correct? But if you have two different flowers, one is having only the pollen grain, that is the stamen, and the other is having only the carpel. So agents like honeybees, insects, wind, water help in transferring the pollen grain from the male flower to the female flower. So such a pollination is called as cross pollination, wherein there are two flowers, and from one flower to the other flower the pollens are being transferred. Clear? Now once the pollen grain reaches the stigma, what happens? Sorry for the interruption. So once the pollen grain reaches the stigma, okay, the immediate thing is it sticks to the stigma because stigma produces a little liquidy, sticky substance, slimy sticky substance. So it sticks to that. Once it reaches there, the pollen grain will rupture, and through that a tiny tubule starts forming towards the style, that is the tubing part of the carpel, and a tiny tube starts generating, and it's produced gradually till it doesn't reaches the ovary. It keeps growing towards the ovary. Okay, so let's look into these steps. After the pollen grain falls on the stigma, the process where the pollen grain sticks to the stigma is called as fertilization. So fertilization is the process in which the male gamete present in the pollen grain joins with the female gamete. How is that done? So fertilization is basically the fusing of the male and the female gametes. Now pollen has already landed on the stigma. So the tube is produced, it moves towards the ovary. The moment the tube touches the ovary, the gamete, the male gamete, which is also called as the sperm cell, the male gamete is gradually released by the pollen grain, and it starts moving downwards through this tubule, and it reaches the ovary, wherein the male gamete and the female gamete fuse together. And this process of fusing of male and female gamete is called as fertilization. So when the pollen grain falls on the stigma, it bursts open and grows a pollen tube downwards, that is through the style towards the female gamete, that is the ovary. It is through the style inside the carpel. Okay. Now the male gamete will move down the pollen tube. The pollen tube enters the ovule of the ovary, and the tip of the pollen tube will then burst. Once the tubule, that is the pollen tube, touches the ovary, then the pollen grain will burst off and the male gamete is released. The male gamete will again, as I already explained, it will start moving down the tubule, enter the ovary, and it will fuse with the female gamete. This process is called as fertilization. Okay, so the male gamete of the pollen combines with the nucleus of the female gamete and it forms a fertilized egg. And this process is called as fertilization. After the fertilization, the cell which is formed is called as zygote. Okay. So what happens once the fertilization is done? That is when the formation of the fruit and the seeds takes place. So after the fertilization, the zygote, as I already mentioned, the female, after the fertilization, the male and the female now don't remain as separate. They fuse together. The nucleus of both the gametes mix together physically and biologically, and they form a new cell. That new cell or new part which is formed is called as zygote. It divides several times to form an embryo within the ovule. When it divides means it's going to form n number of cells. So group of n number of cells is called as embryo. Then the ovule forms the tough seed coat, a coat, and it forms the seed coat, and inside the seed coat there is a seed, whereas the embryo will form the fruit. Okay, so embryo has two parts. The will change into a seed, and the outside layer will change into the bulgy part, which is the fruit. Okay, so the ovule develops into a tough coat and is gradually converted into seed. The ovary grows rapidly and ripens to form the fruit. Petals, sepals, stamen, style, they all will shrivel, means they'll dry off and they'll fall off. So what is left out is the ovule part only, wherein the ovules will change into seed coat and the ovary, the outside bulgy part, will change into the fruit. So as you can see in the tomato, the seeds are the ovules and the reddish flesh part that we eat is the ovary. So this is how fertilization happens and a new plant is produced. Basically, not the plant, but the seed is produced. And when this seed, when it is germinated, when it is sown in the soil, it germinates to produce a new plant. So this is the way how a flowering plant reproduces sexually. Hope it is clear. Thank you.